Good afternoon, everyone. This is Terry Cash with the National Dropout Prevention Center, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Marty Duckenfield, and we welcome you to our broadcast for Solutions to the Dropout Crisis. This monthly radio webcast is brought to you by the National Dropout Prevention Center at Clemson University in partnership with Clemson Radio Productions and the generous support of Penn Foster and Catapult Learning.
Well, welcome to our listeners. We're all delighted that you've chosen to join us for this exceptional professional development opportunity. We always like to extend a special welcome to the new listeners to the broadcast. Today's program is on a topic that we all need to find out more about. And so I feel very fortunate that our two guests are actually here in the studio with us for the next hour or so as we learn more about the mysteries of data assessment and student learning. But first of all, let me remind our listeners of the materials provided on the website for today's program. First of all and foremost is the slide presentation. It's in fact a PowerPoint in a PDF format, and it will support today's discussion, so have that open and ready. There's some really interesting and helpful articles that we've collected which focus on how to use classroom assessment to improve teaching. Perhaps you had the chance to read some of these before the program, Terry. I think you were spending some time doing that today. But I know that for all of us, they will surely be useful afterwards to reinforce what you learned today. There's some websites with some hands-on information regarding classroom assessment data and how to use it. And let me point out Jennifer's blog, which she may mention later, called Art of Educating. So, Terry, a solid list of resources, great support for learning how to improve. Educators can help their students improve, and by the way, increase student success and graduation rates.
Well, you're right, Marty. I did have a chance to look at the resources, and it definitely is an excellent compilation of resources. And today's program will provide our listeners with a great introduction about just how to implement this important strategy for school improvement.
You know, the wonderful thing about the webcast is that you, the listeners, have the opportunity to engage in discussion with our presenters. And so we invite you to consider being an active part of the program. And there are two ways you can connect to us. And since this is a radio call-in show, we encourage you to call in your questions for our guests. Our toll-free number is 888-539-8859. And for those calling outside the U.S., the number is 864-656-4549. You may begin calling in now or any time during the program. We'll put you on hold for a few minutes, but we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during the broadcast. Now, all our callers today will receive a copy of a free book of their choice from the National Dropout Prevention Center's Effective Strategies series. Eric will take down your email address and phone number so we can contact you about which one you'd like to receive.
And Marty, all our callers will also have a chance to put their names in a hat, or have their names put in a hat for a drawing in May to get a free conference registration to the 2011 National Dropout Prevention Network Conference in Chicago. And this includes the callers from our previous broadcasts over the past school year.
Hey, Terry, that's a great offer. We're also accepting email questions sent to our email address, which is ndpc@clemson.edu. Put the word solutions in the subject line so we can find it in the midst of all the other emails that come to our center. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as well. So we're looking forward to all the calls and questions today.
Well, our topic this month is dropout prevention through data and assessment literacy. And with us today, right here in the studio, are Dr. Cindy Johnson-Taylor and Dr. Jennifer Morrison, both teacher educators from Newberry College in Newberry, South Carolina. Cindy is the chair of the Education Department in Newberry, and Jen is the assistant professor there as well as assistant director of the Retain Center of Excellence, which stands for Retain and Empower Teachers Through Action, Innovation, and Network, with the goal of improving teacher retention in South Carolina. The Retain Center is funded by the South Carolina Commission on Higher Education. The National Dropout Prevention Center has been working with Cindy and Jen, as well as Dr. Renee Stubbs, also assistant professor of secondary education at Newberry College, on developing teacher training modules, and the most recent and highly regarded is on data and assessment literacy. We're pleased to be putting a positive spotlight on this topic and how it can truly help teachers and students. I gather it's becoming a known phrase now, data assessment and literacy, or DAL. And so I suggest to our listeners that they search the Internet when using this terminology after the program. But first, we're delighted to have you both join us here at Clemson to share your expertise on data and assessment literacy. So Cindy and Jen, thank you so much for coming, and we're pleased to have you.
Thank you for having us.
We're very excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much. There are many concerns today about data-driven instruction. Testing and teaching to the test seems to be the major response to this topic when you talk among educators. And yet, if we do data right, it does not become teaching to the test, but rather answers the question. How can I assess if my students are learning? How can I find out which students need help? And which areas do they need help? Questions like these can be answered if teachers understand how to collect and analyze appropriate data. And knowing all of this is something called data literacy. So today we're going to learn how we as educators become data literate and use this knowledge effectively in our classrooms. But before we start, let me remind our listeners they can call us with their questions, and that number again is toll-free, 888-539-8859. And for those of you calling outside the U.S., that area code would be 864-656-4549. So, Cindy, let's turn to your PowerPoint and let's get started.
Okay, thank you. Well, for our listeners, we know that you can't see us, so we wanted you to see a picture of what we look like right now in the studio. I'm the one on the right, and seriously, this picture was taken my freshman year in college. I'm a child of the 80s, and I guess, as you can tell, this was taken during the big hair days. Jen, I love your hairstyle in the picture on the left, and you look great. Tell us about your picture.
So everyone should be looking at the slide that has both of our pictures on it, and yes, I am the person on the left. And Cindy, that was a picture that that was taken actually just yesterday. And actually, no. That was my senior picture when I graduated from high school in 1989. So, but I wanted to ask you something, because you and I have known each other for a little while now, Cindy, and what do you think my worst subject in high school was?
Well, we've had a lot of conversations about history and politics, so I imagine you like social studies, and I know that you have been a middle school and high school English teacher, so I know you like English. I'm guessing your worst subject was math.
You think so?
I think so.
Really? Because, I'm a data and assessment specialist. But actually, you are right. Math was my worst subject in school. And really, the way that it all worked out was when I was in high school in South Carolina, I had to take Algebra 2, which all students have to take. And I had a series of substitutes in the room, and I felt like I never really learned the math, and I didn't really understand it. It was too hard for my parents to really help me with, and that kind of thing, and I did not do well. And so I decided that I was bad at math, and I never took math again. Never. So I would take computer science. I would do anything I could not to take math. And so when I was going to graduate with my undergraduate degree, I had to take a business calculus class. This was 7 years after the last time I had taken math. And I walked into the room thinking, I'm horrible at math. And the instructor in there was a very nice man, but he had a very heavy Russian accent. And I thought to myself, oh no, this is very bad. And so I went to get some tutoring, and the first thing I said to him when I walked in for tutoring was, listen, I hate math, and I'm really, really bad at math. And he said a thing that really changed my life. He said, Jennifer, that is just too bad, because he said, not that way. He said, that's really unfortunate, because math isn't about numbers. Math isn't about formulas. Math is simply a way of thinking. It's a very logical way of thinking. And that was revelatory to me, because I think that teaching is about thinking. And as a middle school teacher, I taught for 10 years in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. I taught at-risk students who had not passed their end of grade test and were in danger of not being able to go on to high school. And then I've taught also in rural South Carolina, kids that are very different than those urban Charlotte kids. And now, of course, I'm teaching at Newberry College, a whole nother group. And really, when I think about teaching, the focus really is on teaching students to think. No matter where they are, it's all about the thinking. And as a teacher, I have to get to their thinking. And so data and assessment is all about getting at students' thinking. All right, everybody, if you would flip your slide, you should see a clock next.
So our agenda for today is to explore some very important questions, such as what is data and assessment literacy? Why do teachers need to be data literate? Why don't teachers jump up and down with excitement when we talk about data and assessment? And what are some practices involved in this literacy that can help teachers engage their students in the classroom?
And I have to say, Cindy, I have to give a warning sort of up front. I think there are a lot of magic bullets out there, and you go and everybody wants you to buy their product. But today's workshop, what we're going to talk about here today with you all, is it's nothing magical. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't fabulous. It just means that it's not magical. And but there's going to be a big difference, because a lot of times when we hear people talking about data and assessment these days, as a teacher, this is what I heard. Large districts, small districts, all over the place. That data and assessment, it's all about the test. It's all about getting the kids to pass the test. But what data and assessment literacy, in terms of how we're defining it today, it's a different discussion. We're not going to talk about being data driven. We hear that word all the time. And actually, teachers make a lot of decisions in their classroom. They use a lot of information to make those decisions, and we could call all those things data, but I'm going to say that we need to be informed by data. We create assessments to inform us so that we can instruct and design better interventions for our students. When we talk about data and assessment literacy today, we're going to be talking about it from a teacher's classroom perspective. I am a teacher from the classroom. This is where this comes from. You're going to see how data and assessment can be professionalizing and empowering for teachers. And we're going to use what's really common sense in the classroom. And I want everyone out there to tailor what we discuss to your particular context. And so when you call in with your questions, feel free to call in with something that's very specific to your context, and we'll see where we can go with that.
I think the most important factor to remember when we talk about data and assessment literacy is that it's all about the student.
Exactly, because one of the things that we're trying to do is to help students be successful, to know that they're successful so they stay in school and they get what they need to move on in their lives. So everyone, if you would flip your slides, you should see a picture of a teacher and a student. And so I'm going to tell you, just to start us off, I'd like to tell you a story. In my story, there's a teacher, and as there is always with a teacher, there's a student. Flip the slide. Let's say that the teacher has to teach some particular South Carolina science standards, or even English language arts standards, or any particular subject area. And the teacher decides that the best topic to teach these standards is a unit on birds. So that unit is particularly suited. So this teacher, who is very engaging and accomplished, teaches. So thinks about the unit about birds, then makes sure that he or she says explicit things about birds during instruction to put that vision of the bird unit into action. So the thinking is there, the explicitness is there, the instruction is going to the student. Flip the slide. But what happens in this story is that the student thinks and learns something completely different. Now, Cindy, you've been in education for a long time. This is a very common story. This happens a lot. And of course, we're not being literal, in terms of our pictures here. It's not necessarily owl, but obviously the student is thinking something completely different than what the teacher is thinking, and even what the teacher explicitly expressed during instruction. So, Cindy, what do you think that happens?
I think it happens for a lot of reasons. One could just be poor communication. The teacher and the student aren't communicating well. Another could be teaching style. Probably one of the biggest would be the life experiences and the background knowledge that the student brings to the classroom, and that student's particular learning style could also be a factor. And then you have to consider what students need. What are their physiological needs? What do they need in the classroom to understand what the teacher's trying to convey? And for whatever reason it happens, I think it happens an awful lot in classrooms.
I think it does. So let's continue the story. If you flip the slide. So there's the story, but let's add assessment to that story. Say that the teacher actually gives an assessment at the end of the bird unit, and that assessment looks like this. It's all about that teacher's thinking. It reflects the teacher's thinking and what the teacher thinks that he or she taught explicitly. So what happens to the student when this assessment is given? What happens, Cindy?
Well, the student fails because he was not able to provide the teacher exactly what the teacher was looking for.
And so the teacher might actually think certain things. Why did that failure happen? What is that about? And a lot of assumptions can come out of that, which those assumptions could be valid or invalid, but obviously the student is not going to be successful. So if you would, please flip the slide. So say, for example, the standards were OWL, and or maybe the standards the teacher was going for are OWL, or the teacher was thinking OWL, and the assessment at the end of the unit was something that's designed, a benchmark designed by the district, or maybe the assessment came from a textbook or something like that. But what you get is this assessment that does not reflect the OWL, and it's something almost completely different. How is a student going to do there, Cindy? What do you think?
Well, the student's going to fail again.
And then there are going to be all kinds of assumptions that are made about why that student wasn't successful on that assessment. Or maybe the teacher doesn't even know, so there are all kinds of things that happen there. But what if you flip the slide, what if the teacher wants to be very student-centered and so creates a final assessment where, say, for example, the student has to create a poster about his or her learning during the bird unit, and then what you get is an assessment that looks like that. So what can the teacher learn from that assessment?
Well, the teacher can learn that the student did learn something, but it wasn't exactly what the teacher intended to convey.
That might be all the teacher can get out of that particular assessment. So, and again, if the teacher sort of thought of this poster idea, but then was still thinking OWL, then maybe the student still fails. That could be something as well. So go ahead and flip the slide. And I want you to just be with me for a minute, because I'm working, and I love Terry because he called me Dr. Morrison, but I'm actually working on my PhD right now. And so for my PhD, I've had to take a lot of statistics classes. And so I know about statistics. I can talk about z-scores all day long. But I want to give a definition of reliability and validity that I think is particularly appropriate, not to 5,000 students at a time, but to one classroom, to teachers. So when I say reliability, what I mean is the extent to which an assessment consistently measures what it's supposed to measure. A lot of people call that validity, but I'm going to use that consistency as looking at reliability. So when I say validity, what I mean is the degree to which a teacher can make accurate inferences about student learning from an assessment. Okay, so one relates to the test or the assessment itself, because it doesn't have to be a test. Does it measure what it's supposed to measure consistently? And then validity is what happens in the teacher's mind in when you get the results. What kind of inferences are made. So now we actually at Newberry College just designed a class because teachers out in the field right now have some difficulty with this. But imagine somebody coming through who's never even seen a standard before. And so we've done a lot of work with this. And what I tell the students is reliability is in the assessment and validity is in the teacher's head. And I make them actually point. So you guys could point too. But reliability is on the test. Validity is in the teacher's head. So if you flip the slide. So when we think about this whole story, the story of the teaching and the assessment and what the student's thinking, validity and reliability can have a lot to do with what's happening in this story. And we do hear these words all the time. So say, for example, with reliability, Cindy, which assessment there on the slide do you think is actually most reliable?
The owl.
The owl. Because, I mean, that's what the teacher was intending to teach. But what if the standards were eagle? See, that would be a whole nother ball game. Right. And then so we have a different kind of reliability issue there. In terms of validity, we have to think, okay, what kinds of inferences can this teacher make from all these different assessments? Which ones would be more accurate or valid, and which ones would be less accurate or valid? So reliability and validity have a lot to do with the story. Mm-hmm. So if we flip the slide.
Yeah, I know one reason that we put an assessment class into the teacher education program at Newberry College, and the reason that it's a main focus of our teacher retention grant, is because many teachers and principals don't understand this story.
Mm-mm. And then what happens, and with all the hundreds of teachers that I've worked with, because I travel around working with principals and classroom teachers all over the U.S. and even internationally, is when you don't understand the story and you get a bunch of data dumped on you, or you get assessments thrown in there, and you don't understand the story, or you just don't have that background, then none of it actually makes sense. We end up going through all of these motions, and the result is really that schools end up creating assessments that don't help them improve learning. There's data that are dumped on teachers who see no need for it, and then we blame them when they aren't interested. We blame students, we blame teachers, we accept blame as teachers and schools when unreliable assessments tell us our students fail. We get frustrated, we waste time, and we end up reinforcing the status quo. So if you flip it. So you should be on a slide that says something with numbers. This is an album cover. Great group. You should check it out. So the worst scenario here, and I've seen this in schools, the worst scenario for teachers and schools is data distraction, where we collect, we have this program and that program, we're getting all this information, we're creating notebooks, we're creating data websites, we're creating data walls, we have whole data rooms, and it's all about collecting, and it's not telling us anything because we don't understand the story. And that is data distraction. And actually, there's a fair amount of research that's coming out now, really in the last 5 years or so, that really show that all this data collection doesn't do anything except make things worse. And, there's research that shows that, if we assume that we have the data, then everything's going to be fine. But actually, that is false. There's research out there that shows that interim assessment data don't always really lead to increased student achievement, and actually can decrease student achievement because of data distraction. And there was a Philadelphia school district that found that teachers were actually using interim data to determine content to teach, but it didn't actually help them understand what students were really learning. They were making incremental decisions about what they were doing next based on a test, but they never really understood what their students were learning. So if you would flip it.
I think the big lesson here is that we have to understand the story in order to be successful at data and assessment literacy.
Mm-hmm. And so data and assessment literacy, my friends, I said it was going to be common sense. Data and assessment literacy is about understanding that story.
Well, Jen, what would you perceive to be the difference between assessment for learning and assessment of learning? Is that what you're talking about here?
Well, a lot of it is. So if you think about the story, Terry, we talk about summative assessment, we talk about formative assessment. Summative assessment is that end result where it's an assessment of learning. It's a done deal, but assessment for learning, you're trying to figure out what the kid's thinking actually is, or, the students, because I teach older folks as well. So, you're trying to figure out what's in the heads of your students. And that's assessment for learning because you're using that information to see where they are and move next steps. So it's really the difference when people talk about, assessment of learning and assessment for learning. I think they're really talking about the difference between summative and formative assessment.
Right. And you really haven't spelled it out yet. But when you talk about data, are you differentiating between qualitative and quantitative for teachers?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
And I don't want to steal Cindy's thunder. She's got this going on. But yeah, I think that when I say data, I'm really meaning information.
Okay. Yeah, and there's an interesting question from our friend Dan in Austin, Texas.
Hey, Dan.
And he's online, so we can't talk to him unless you call Dan. But anyway, he asks, where does the power of anecdotal data enter into the formula of retaining and empowering students and their teachers? How can the power of stories help prevent dropout in your minds? And have we begun to capture any statistical correlation between story and preventing dropout? So that's anecdotal data is what Dan is throwing on the table here.
Let me just go with the anecdotal data,
okay.
And because I think the power of story is big, but we'd have to really, I think that would be a whole nother session on relating story to data. But we are telling a story here, that story of data and assessment literacy, so people understand, where we are. But in terms of anecdotal data, Dan, I think that data is just information, and I'm saying that teachers need to be informed by data. But if you really think about it, everything is data because everything is information and everything feeds into a teacher's brain, including his or her experience. And so, when we say anecdotal data, we're just calling, I see this, I remember this, here's a story of something that I've experienced. All of that could actually be considered data and be considered in the same ways that standardized test scores could be.
Well, I think too, Jen, that it really, the research is pretty clear that you're making you're making the learning real to the life and personalized. And I think there's a lot of research that supports that.
Well, you have to know your students, don't you? I mean, one of the reasons that students drop out is because they feel like they're not known. They're not connected with. They're totally alien to the school environment. And, when I taught middle school in Charlotte, those students were very, very different than I was and that I am. And I had to gain a lot of information about what was in their heads and what their experiences were. I had to know if they were thinking blackbird and I was thinking owl. It was just really important because I also knew that if they didn't think eagle, they weren't going on to high school. So I had to be there with it and really get at that. And so really, when I talk about data and assessment literacy, it's not about a test, it's not about a program, it's about the students. And I think that's one of the strong points that will keep our kids in school.
Okay.
Okay, we ready to go to the next slide?
I think we can move on. Right.
Okay. Well, Terry got us going on this slide by asking his question a few minutes ago. You should see a title that says Data, What Are They and How Are They Used? So to understand the story Jen just told us about the owls and the blackbirds and the eagles, we really do have to define what we mean by data. And we've just written a national report that was full of data. So we are really filled up with mean scores and z-scores and t-scores and standard deviations. But when we define data, what we really mean is pieces of information, often in number form. Sometimes there are so many that you have to encompass them with a descriptive statistic like a z-score. And sometimes we want to compare them, so we use standard deviations. But it's really important to note that data do not have to be numbers. Qualitative data such as quotes, writing, observations, codes, themes, etc. are all important. And Victoria Bernhardt says that there are 4 types of data, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes and how they apply to real-life classrooms. The point is that data are much more than we get from standardized testing. I started out as a high school assistant principal. I walked into my office, and I had a degree from a really good institution in educational administration, and I walked in and they said, here's your file cabinet full of test scores. I didn't know what to do with it. I had absolutely no idea how to use that data. I think teachers and principals have gotten much better at that now. But our listeners might want to think for just a minute about how data are being used in their schools. The best use of data, as Jen has already said, is to inform. Using data to punish or to reward is likely to create a compliance system, but it's not going to create any commitment to learning. And we read a really good book recently in our professional book club called The Death and Life of the American School System by Diane Ravitch. So if you want more information on this topic, that's an excellent book to read.
And Diane talks about how punishing and rewarding based on test scores is one of the problems in our system right now. And, as we know, if you just think at the classroom level, the students who have the hardest time in school are the ones that really need to be the most committed. And we have to do everything we can to help students be committed. And so when we use data, whether it's anecdotal or it's quantitative, to punish or even to reward students, get the right test score and, you win an iPod, that actually may create compliance, but it's not going to get us the commitment from students that we need for them to graduate from high school.
So if we flip to the next slide, Nancy Love, in Using Data to Improve Learning for All, a collaborative inquiry approach, gives us a really good comprehensive definition of data literacy. Data literacy is the ability to interpret and use multiple data sources effectively to improve teaching and learning.
Mm-hmm. And listeners, I'd like you to really think about that as we talk later on about the 4 types of data. So if you flip the slide, you should see a slide that says not. This is a very important slide in this presentation because, number one, we can't assume that teachers or principals are data literate. Because I remember when I went through teacher education, my entire assessment course really revolved around how do you write multiple choice tests. And then my experience in schools was very lacking because it was all about that standardized test. And so the vision of what data could be used for, what assessment, how to design assessments that get me the data that I need as a teacher was not really there. So we can't assume that teachers or principals are data literate. And that's just the environment. I think things are changing. That's what we're here to do, right, Cindy?
Exactly.
Exactly. So, but data is important because data and assessment literacy is not a workbook, my friends. It is not. It is a habit or a mindset. Data and assessment literacy is not about compliance. It's about commitment and leadership, teachers and students. Data and assessment literacy is not a guarantee of great test scores in the short term because, as we know, those tests may not be reliable. But data and assessment literacy is about sustained growth in the long term and understanding why all these things are happening, and when something doesn't go the way that it needs to, then why. It's no more shooting in the dark.
But Jen, I must interrupt. I mean, I deal with teachers all over the country, and they're very concerned about the test scores, and they're being measured by test scores. Mm-hmm. And so how then do you weigh how are you going to measure future learning and growth and et cetera versus they're being measured for the test scores? And so how are you going to sell this to teachers who are being measured by their test scores?
Well, certainly education isn't necessarily about, always selling. But I mean, as a teacher, I've always been assessed with test scores. And we're moving into teacher effectiveness being measured by test scores. And, what I can say is this. As a teacher, I had pretty successful test scores. But, there were years where I had all the highest scores in my school. Even in using value-added measures. But then there were a couple of years where it just flatlined and it wasn't what it needed to be. Now, I was a stable variable there, but I was able to see that. And I was able to know enough about my students by gathering all the other kinds of data to really know what they were thinking and were they really ready for this? Where were their weak points? Where did they need work? Even when you're dealing with unreliable measures and things like that, you have a better chance of helping your students be successful when you're looking at all these things. When you understand the story, you have a much, much, much better chance of getting your kids where they need to go.
Are you going to give me some hope here? Because I'm thinking of teaching high school and having 5 or 6 sessions with 30 students in the class, 180 students. And when I test them, I can remember teaching 7th grade and all those darn spelling tests piling up every week and, all those assessments that we had to do and in order to provide grades for our students. So I'm thinking as we go along, it's not just the test at the end of the year, but we're talking all throughout the school year. hundreds of tests, hundreds of students. I'm overwhelmed, and how can I do more than just give them that multiple choice test to have a score, and that's it?
Or you are all about it. Well, what I think is this. We talked about data distraction. It is very easy to be data distracted, especially when you have 180 students. And so when we talk about the practices that are associated with data and assessment literacy, I want us to definitely address that issue, because I am not advocating, Marty, that you go into schools and you collect data every single day, and you collect it and you put it in a binder, and you just you organize it, and you have all these charts and numbers and tables and Excel and all these different kinds of things, because that will distract you. That will distract you from the students who need you the most. So we want to use data and assessment in a way that will target, get the questions that we have answered, so that we really can address very specific things. So we'll talk about that.
Oh, good. I'm looking forward to finding out.
I think Marty brings up a great point, though. Formative assessment is really hard to do. It's time-consuming, and it's much easier to just give the paper pencil test.
It's true. It's true. And formative assessment, and let's just define that, because, all kinds of people use it all kinds of different ways. Formative assessment, as Terry had brought up a little bit earlier on, is when teachers use assessments, which could be formal, such as a quiz or a spelling test, or informal, such as let's have a class discussion or an exit slip. Formative assessment is used to inform instruction. It is assessment for learning, like you said. And now if that teacher in the story had, before that end of unit summative test came along, had done some more formative assessment, that teacher would have known there was a blackbird in the student's head. Because it would have been obvious.
Right.
And, so there is a big function for formative assessment, for sure, in our story. Okay.
Okay, let's move on.
All right. So, friends, you should be moving to a slide that, what you see up top is just principle and something that the principal is saying.
I think this was me in 1996. When I got to that new job and didn't know what to do with the file cabinet full of standardized test scores.
And so pretend like you were saying this to your staff.
Okay. Good afternoon, faculty. I received our state test results earlier this week, and I've got nothing but good news to share. Our average score is in the 88th percentile. That's the highest it's been in the last 10 years. Congratulations to you all, and keep up the good work.
So, Cindy, I have ultimate respect for you. Ultimate respect. And, but, now we've been together for a while, and we've been talking about data and assessment literacy. Do you think that is a literate conversation?
No, it's completely illiterate conversation.
Well, it's not even a conversation.
Right.
Yeah, because to me, this principal actually does not understand why those scores might be that way or what it really means in the long term. There's no understanding of the story here. And just so everyone knows, this is an example that comes from Alan Blankstein's great book, Failure is Not an Option. I'm sure many of you have read it. And but he doesn't talk about data and assessment literacy per se, but he just talks about effective and ineffective conversations about data. But I'm going to go ahead and call this a data illiterate conversation. So it's not even a conversation. Data illiterate statement. So if you would flip your slide. So Cindy, you get to pretend to be the principal, and I'll pretend to be the teacher for you.
Good.
All right.
Ms. Grant.
All right.
Ms. Grant, we need to schedule an appointment to go over your class's test scores from earlier this year and talk about what we need to be doing in the coming months.
I agree, but I already know that those test scores don't paint an accurate picture of what's going on in my classroom now. Since my kids took their test, I've actually seen a radical improvement in both math and reading skills using a few other assessments.
Jen, that's a really valid point. In that case, can we augment our test score analysis with some more recent data? Also, I know you've been working on classroom procedures. When we meet, can we look at the new learning environment, look at the learning environment surveys you gave and see how things are improving? Okay,
now, my friends, I know that this is totally set up, and this does come from Alan Blankstein's book as well. But the point here is this, that the principal is looking for more information. The teacher is looking for more information. The story here is understood. And the conversation might not be as, quite as lame as this between, you and me if we were really talking about things, but the story is understood. And there are actually multiple kinds of data points that would be discussed here. It's not, oh, you had good test scores, or, oh, you had bad test scores, oh, do something about it. It's much deeper. There's a lot more understanding here.
These are the kinds of conversations that principals should want to have in their schools about data and assessment. And I wonder what kind of conversations would take place if folks who are well-versed in data and assessment literacy had these conversations with their students, or with the families of their students, or with their teacher colleagues.
Very nice. That's what we want. That's what I want, students to be able to have this conversation with their teachers and with their principals. And another thing that I was thinking too is this is not a conversation where I think sometimes when you talk about a staff that's data and assessment literate, it's not necessarily that hierarchy between administration and teachers has to go away slightly. We still need principals, we still need teachers, and we need to know, somebody takes care of the buses and somebody takes care of the instruction, and that's what we do. But here, the teacher is not just being compliant. The principal doesn't have to own everything and make people do something and not even understand why. And they're more partners. They're partners in this situation, in this conversation. And I love that. I think that's something that data and assessment literacy in a school can do.
That's one reason we wanted to model having a conversation with each other today, because these are the kinds of conversations we need to have, and we have these conversations all the time at work.
Yeah, and actually I have these conversations all the time with students. I do have these conversations all the time with parents, and they're good conversations. They're quality conversations. They're not confused. There's a lot of understanding. There's a lot of direction. There's a lot of we know what our next steps are, and this is what we need to find out. There's a lot of curiosity instead of fear.
And then the score really means something instead of 88th percentile, which basically means nothing.
Yeah. Well, Jen, since you brought that up, you wrote an article in the December 8th, January 9th issue of Educational Leadership, and you discussed the matter of sharing data and analysis reflection not only with students, but the parents as well. Would you address that just briefly?
Sure. And if any callers want to call or send in questions about this, I would welcome that. So I think it's important for students to own their data. And data can be a lot of things, as we said. It can be scores, it can be grade numbers, it can be a piece of writing, it can be a drawing that we did during class to understand something. It can be anything. Kindergartners collect tons of data. So when I think about the data that my students have, all of their work is data. And so one of my favorite ways of having students own their data and share it and talk about their data and have that data literate conversation with their parents is through student-led conferences. If you really set it up right, then the kids are talking about their information, and then the parents have a lot more to go on than just, oh, you got an 85 in science, and it was an 87 last time. What happened? Because, well, let's look at the work. Let's talk about what I'm really learning, and let's have that true understanding. So I want students to actually initiate those conversations with parents. I want parents asking better questions than, did my kid act right in your class yesterday? Yeah. So because, yes, we need to talk about that, but we also need to talk about learning. That's what I want to get at. Does that answer the question, Terry?
Well, it did very well. Thank you.
All right. So we should be on a slide that has a picture of what you might think is the perfect classroom.
Oh, I remember it well.
But you see also there is a...
As a child, I want to point out I'm the child, not the teacher.
There is a point in the lower right-hand corner. So...
Yeah, the point is that teaching has changed, and teachers have to be data and assessment literate to keep up with the changes. We know two reasons right away that teachers have to be data and assessment literate. The first is that research shows us over and over again that the teacher is the number one influence over a student's learning or on a student's learning. And the second reason is we're spending millions of dollars on longitudinal systems and studies. We're data DJing, data coaching, data specializing, but really to no end. And teachers are unable to take advantage of the data that we're spending all this time, money, and effort to collect. There are other reasons also. The biggest one is that it used to be the teacher in this picture, teaching was about teaching, and today teaching is about learning. Okay.
So if you flip the slides and you look at these two pictures, and actually the picture on the right is some of my students at Piedmont Open Middle, and the big difference here is that back in the day, back in the day when we had overheads, which really wasn't that back in the day.
Not that long ago.
But, so it was all, if that teacher came in the classroom every single day, showed up every single day, and taught for however many periods she was assigned to teach, then she did her job. And if the students didn't learn, well, too bad for them. But these days, in this classroom, to the right there, in my classroom, I can come in and teach all day long, I could flip circles and do all kinds of things. But if those students don't learn, then I have not done my job. There's a huge difference between teaching then and teaching now, and that is the big difference. That then it was all about you did your job if you were teaching. These days, you do your job if your students actually learn. So that's really big, and people don't always recognize that difference, and that is a very big difference in our accountability environment.
I remember from my undergraduate days of a statement that if a learner didn't learn, no teaching had taken place. Mm-hmm. So it's along those same lines.
Absolutely agree with that. So everyone, you should flip your slides, and you should be at a slide that has a quote by Jim Popham or James Popham.
Okay, if you will, everyone just read this quote and think about it for a minute. Wow, one of his first pleas to educators is to become at least reasonably assessment literate. And as Jen said, that's from Jim Popham's The Truth About Testing. According to his work, the most critical factor facing the teaching profession in this era of accountability is the lack of data and assessment literacy, because we are allowing a lot of bad things to happen to students in schools, and that's just not cool.
Mm-hmm. And, and actually Jim would say, and Jim can call me up and tell me if I'm wrong, but he would say that we allowed this to happen, that we gave it up. We allowed the psychometricians and the test publishers and legislation and all kinds of things come down that confuse things, that make it seem, that sometimes it is. I mean, sometimes it's true that the learning isn't happening. But we allowed a lot of what's happening that's creating data distraction. We allowed that to happen as educators, and we have to be literate so we understand what really is happening, what isn't happening, and we do what's right for our students, especially the students that are hit hardest by all of this data and assessment accountability mess that comes our way. And those are our students who tend to drop out. And because, constantly having taught the lowest, when I was teaching at Piedmont Open Middle in Charlotte, I taught the highest level students in English language arts, and I taught the lowest level students, the ones who had not passed and were really in danger of not being able to go on to high school. And the kids who were in the higher level classes, nobody was worried about them, so they didn't get tested all the time. The lowest level students were the ones who got tested, and they had their end of grade test, but then everybody was really worried. So we had quarterly assessments, but then we were really worried because the kids weren't doing well in the quarterly assessment. So we put in mini assessments. So 2 or 3 times a week, you'd have to give a mini assessment to get the kids ready for the quarterly assessment, which is about getting the kids ready for the end of course assessment or the end of grade assessment. And those kids ended up being tested all the time. It became, in the lower level classes, it became a curriculum of tests. And that's just wrong. That's bad. But we allow that to happen as educators. That's what Jim would say.
And we're talking about empowering teachers here today. And I'll just repeat the phone number, and then we do have an email question, so I want to get to that. But those of you who might like to talk to our presenters today, the toll-free number is 888-539-8859. And don't forget the goodies that you get if you call. But here's a question from Ramona, and she says, I am enjoying this session immensely. But just curious, have you or your students ever begun a project thinking that the finished project would be evaluated in one manner, but the course of the project took the group in an entirely different direction, causing a total revamping of the project? So how do you handle that in a timeline issue and a course with a fixed timeline? Ooh.
Ramona, that is such a good question. And because I have gotten into the never-ending unit situation, the never-ending unit. And that's true. That does happen. You start out in a particular direction, and then things change. If they change because of students, that's usually a good thing. And because you do pre-assessments, you see, this is what the kids actually know, or this is what I really need to do, and then you move into a different direction. But, we start with a plan. The thing is, the thing to always remember, and the thing that brings clarity, I believe, to instruction is you want to, not that I want to be necessarily driven by standards, but you have a vision of what you want the students to be able to, that they'll be able to do and know at the end. Stick to that. To that.
Yeah.
And you have to define it. You need to know, as the teacher, as the professional in the room, what those things need to be. Have it clear in your mind. And then you make those accommodations, those modifications. If something's not engaging students, you have to change it up. And you have to get the kids active. You have to get them excited. They have to be committed. And then you have to know where they actually are, and not just think that you know, but actually do some informal, quick, formative assessments to really know where they are. But take them there. Know from the beginning what you want them to know and be able to do, and take them there. Make the accommodations as you're going along, but don't ever lose sight of where you're trying to take them. Okay. And, all the stuff by Grant Wiggins about backwards design and all of that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And Popham actually wrote a book called Transformative Assessment that speaks very, very much to that kind of designing with the end in mind.
Well, our last program was about project-based learning, so I know that many of our listeners are from that group, and this is really helpful for them. And I've just been at the National Service Learning Conference, where this is a huge question. So thank you for calling in or writing, Ramona. And by the way, Ramona's from Florida. We always like to say where they're from. And so thank you for that. And I think it's time to move on to kind of find out how we're going to do this now.
Okay.
But I'm going to say this before we move on. There are a lot of good reasons why teachers do not jump up and down with excitement about data and assessment. Because I'm a teacher. And it actually takes a fair amount for me to jump up and down about anything, because I'm tired. I'm teaching a lot of students. I have a lot to do. I have piles of papers. I have, duties. I have all kinds of things going on. Because data and assessment, when you're doing it right, you're going to be working hard. You may be working harder than you are working now. But, and it does seem a lot of times that data and assessment require expert knowledge, because it's been in the accountability environment. If you don't really know what a Z-score is or what a standard deviation means, it might seem that this is the work of experts. It's also not expected. We have pacing guides. We have all these things that tell teachers what to do and how to do it. And, we're not always expected to be this empowered and really use data and assessment for our own ends in terms of for the students. And also it's risky, because what if you get back data that's not great? Well, to me, sure, I've had data that comes back that just isn't fabulous, but you move on, you learn from it, you make some good, valid inferences from that, and you move, and you just keep on moving. And so now we're going to talk about 4 practices that can help build a teacher and principal's data and assessment literacy.
Okay, so next slide, you have a diagram from Victoria Bernhardt. And very quickly, I'm just going to run through with you what the 4 types of data are according to Bernhardt. And then we're going to play a little game so that you can really understand those. But Victoria Bernhardt, who writes widely about data and assessment in schools, maintains that there are 4 types of data, and that we as teachers have to be informed by all 4 types of data. The first is demographic. You know what that means. That's who is involved. Info about students, teachers, families, communities. It's not about skin color. It's not about the free or reduced lunch percentages in the school. It's more about what the student watches on TV, what kind of food he or she eats, what the student's interested in. Student learning data is the second type, and this is anything that has to do with showing what students have learned. Standardized tests, performance assessments, grades. This is the one everybody gets so excited about. When you think about No Child Left Behind, you know that we are asked to look at demographic data and student learning data. But Victoria Bernhardt says you cannot get an accurate assessment picture unless you look at all four. So the third type of data is perceptions data. This tells us what the stakeholders think about what is going on. One way a teacher might get at perception data would be through interest inventory or an exit slip or a survey. And then the fourth type of data is process data. What have we done to make learning happen? In a classroom, this data does not get collected very much at all. We tend to overlook it.
So for example, as a language arts teacher in middle school, you have certain things that you're using. I might use, a vocabulary program, let's say vocabulary program A. Seems to be working pretty well. Well, then, I go to a workshop and I find out about vocabulary program B, but I don't want to give up A because it may be working. So I add B. And then my district says that we need to use vocabulary program C, but I'm not sure about that. So I end up doing vocabulary A, vocabulary B, and vocabulary C. And then what happens when vocabulary D, comes around? So this happens to schools, but it happens to teachers all the time as well. So we have to look at what we're using and how well we have to think back and look at the information about what we're using and make some good inferences based on that.
Okay. I'll look at Susie.
Okay, let's talk about Susie. And Susie is my sister. And if she were listening to our program, she would get really upset with me. But I think that she is not. So we're just going to go with it. So I have 6 data points here. And so you should be on a slide that says, what do the data make you think? And we're going to pretend that Cindy can only see one piece of data at a time. And I'm just going to ask her what kind of data it is and what does it tell her about Susie as a student. So Cindy, you're pretending you're a teacher making some decisions about how to teach Susie. Okay? That's what we're doing.
Got it.
All right, so Cindy, Susie scored a level 2, which is not passing. Just so you know, 3 and 4 are passing. Susie scored a level 2 on her 2007-2008 grade 8 reading end of grade test. What do you think you should do for Susie as a teacher?
Well, Susie needs help reading. That's student learning data, first of all.
Okay, it's student learning data.
And apparently Susie is not a very good reader.
Okay, so Susie's not a good reader. So that's, and a lot of times that's the only amount of information, that's the only piece of data that a lot of teachers are moving on. But let me give you another piece of data just to, add to it. How about the second bullet point? Susie scored a level 2 in 6th and 7th grades, but her elementary scores were consistently higher. What do you think about Susie now?
Well, that's student learning data also, and I think something happened to Susie in the transition from elementary school to middle school that caused her not to be a good reader.
Okay, so something changed, and she's not a good reader. All right, so that's 2 right there. Okay, so let me throw in a third piece of data. Susie is the oldest of 3 children who are being raised by a single mother. Now, what kind of data is that?
That's demographic data.
That's demographic data. And so what do you think about Susie now?
Well, now I realize that if her mom's single with 3 children, she's probably working 2 or 3 jobs. She's not home much. She's not giving Susie any support at home. Okay,
so we have 3 pieces of data now. And, of course, we have to be really careful about the assumptions that we make about students. Be careful about the assumptions that you make about my sister, just so you know. All right, so then let's look at a fourth piece of data. Susie's mother is a college-educated registered nurse. What kind of data is that?
Demographic data, and that changes everything. Because now it lets us know that Susie lives in a home that values education.
Yeah, because her mom would have had to have gone through. So the issue may not be necessarily that education isn't valued in the home, or maybe even that Susie doesn't like reading. I mean, it could be a lot of things. So we're looking at student learning data, we're looking at demographic data, but let me throw another piece of data in there. Say we did a survey, an interest survey, and we find out that Susie hates to read, but she likes soccer.
Wow. Well, that's perception data because that's Susie's perception of what she likes to do, and we can make some inferences about that. I would think probably that means Susie needs a more active learning environment, that just sitting and reading might not be active enough for her.
Yeah.
And maybe if she's going to read, we should let her read something that interests her, maybe a book about soccer.
So, what I see you doing as a teacher is you're making some better decisions and interventions for Susie based on more and more data, which is what Bernhardt would suggest. That's why we have to look at all of them. But I got to throw one last piece of data in. So you have to get Susie ready for her assessment. So the big summative assessment in the end of the year. So If you look at the last bullet, for the past 2 years, Susie's reading teachers have used a workbook series called Sharpen Up, End of Grade Test Prep series. What do you think now?
Well, now I think that first of all, that's process data.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we probably need to look closely at the Sharpen Up Test Prep series, because Susie took a dive in reading as soon as she got to middle school, and they've been using that program the whole time she's been there.
So it could be not necessarily, well, we know she doesn't like reading, or she's saying that she doesn't like reading. Is it that process that caused her not to like reading? And so, but the thing is that we have a much better picture of Susie when you're looking at all 4 kinds of data and you're looking at data over time. Now, to go back to Marty's concern about, oh my gosh, I'm going to have thousands of pages of, I'm going to just be, formative assessment to me is not something that you just do. I think it's a habit of mind, constantly finding out what students are thinking. That's a habit. And you can do it 300 different ways in a given week. And, but what I did with my at-risk students, or what I will continue, that I always do with students who are at risk of not moving on, is I want to design an intervention. I want to figure out what is a thing that's going to make it work. And I actually made myself like even a little form, and I interview the student a lot of time, or I interview the parents and the student, and I just gather that information for those particular students that I'm very, very concerned about. And you never know what kind of crazy intervention you're going to come up with when you have all of these different data pieces of all 4 different kinds over time. Then you do something that you never would have thought of. And that is the thing. That's the thing that works. It's amazing.
So too often we make decisions about students using only one type of data.
Or 2.
Or 2, but when we use richer data, we can make a lot better decisions to enhance their learning.
Data over time in all 4 types.
I mean, this is another application of that term. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And the more knowledge you have, the more you understand of the situation. That's a great slide. Appreciate
and I
that
think
one.
it's using data as a prescriptive way and as a risk intervention plan or student success plan is what it turns out to be for each individual student.
So then we're gonna go to another practice. Number 2, you flip your slide, you see a picture of a guy looking very critically conscious. And then if you flip the slide again, being critically conscious is about
knowing yourself and knowing your students' learning.
Okay, and so I gave this test in one of my classes, and, you give a test and you think you're giving an owl test, you might be giving an eagle test, and the students actually might be thinking blackbird. So I kind of have to figure that out. And so there's a lot of literature out there that now that talks about an item analysis. And so what this is an item analysis where I just went through as the students took the test. There were 24 students, and I made hatch marks next to each one for how many students missed it. And obviously the students had some real issues with this. But then on the ones where the students were missing it the most, you see sort of going out to the right, you have A, B, C, D. And I have to tell you, it's really hard to write a really good multiple choice test. So I don't ever assume that I'm giving an owl test. I never do. And but I took the answers, and A was the correct answer for number 11. And I just marked how many kids put that answer. So really only 5 students in number 11 put the correct answer, and everybody else put incorrect answers. But then it's almost evenly divided between the others. I mean, a lot of people put B, but what that means to me is that when I designed that question, or it could be, I don't think it's a question actually, I think they just had no idea. Really it's evenly divided. But when you look down at number 19, the correct answer was A, or no, the correct answer was D, but look how an equal number of kids almost put A. So that means when I was writing I got tricky. I was trying to get them to apply. It just got tricky. So it's good to realize that instead of making assumptions, and it actually is even better to talk with students about this or have them analyze doing their own item analysis. So that's critical consciousness. If you flip the slide, helping students be critically conscious is also really important. I want students to be able to talk about their own learning, as Terry and I have talked about a little bit. But this is a really interesting piece of this is an interesting assessment instrument. I have my kids write an essay on a prompt at the beginning of the school year. And then I got their answers. I hadn't taught anything, and I just put them away. I never graded them. I just put them in a filing cabinet. And then at the end of the year, I wanted to figure out if I had taught, and I was trying to teach SAT writing, and so I had an SAT rubric that I used all year long. And so at the end of the year, I had them write on the same prompt and use the same rubric to assess it. And I took the ones from the beginning of the year and the ones from the end of the year, mixed them all up, took the names off, coded them, and had a friend of mine grade them, another English teacher. And then this is what came back. And then I, took the codes and I gave it to the student. So you see, this is a student reflection right here. All I did was fill in the fall score, the spring score, and the change. And I actually had gone through and looked at all my classes and see how they did and whatever. But, the cool thing was I found out that I taught SAT writing. Rock on.
Yeah, that's
great.
That's great. And also, you, as you said early on, students need to own their own data.
Yeah,
and so this puts them in a position of having to do that. On the next slide is a third practice that we think builds data and assessment literacy, and that is to assess on target, not on topic. So most standards will say something like this. The student will be able to define unfamiliar words using context clues. But then what many teachers do when they teach that standard is they teach the definition and they have students memorize it. And then when they assess that standard, they have students regurgitate the definition on the assessment. So that's what we mean when we say that this teacher is teaching on topic. She's teaching vocabulary, but she's not teaching on target with the standard. And just an important point about assessment is it must be on target.
And the thing is that, Terry had asked that really good question about, well, what about the standardized test at the end of the year? What I'm saying is to be literate, you have a better chance. So if you're teaching on target rather than on topic, you have a better chance. Your students have a better chance of being successful because you are actually moving toward that targeted standard. So if you flip the slide, the fourth practice, and there are many more, but we just wanted to talk about these sort of big four here today, is really, as a teacher, be curious. Ask questions. Think about what do you need to know to reach Susie? What is it going to take to get Susie engaged, to get Susie committed, to get her, not committed, but committed to learning? My sister, and committed to learning. And so, what is it going to take to make that happen? I mean, think about that. Think about the students that you have. What questions do you need to ask? What questions do you have that if you had the answer, that would make all the difference? And so if you flip the slide, the last thing that we have on here is, what I'm asking you to do really is to pretend that you have this crystal ball. So if I tell you, just tell me what the questions are, and then we'll ask the crystal ball and you'll get an answer, then you're going to be the teacher that you need to be. And a data and assessment literate teacher asks questions, then designs assessments that go and get that data to answer those questions. My friends, assessment is your crystal ball.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I guess on the next slide we see how we can keep in touch with both of you, and I think you're both willing to take questions from our listeners and as they come in, and we will forward them to you because this is a huge topic, and you've touched the surface and kind of really helped us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think Cindy and Jen, you certainly have provided a great introduction for our listeners on this topic of data and assessment literacy. It's been a very informative program, and I've certainly enjoyed reading the materials that you provided, and with the resources posted, our listeners can now become data literate and be able to support learning more successfully. It's indeed been a most valuable hour and a quick hour, and we really appreciate you taking time to be with us here at Clemson today and with all of our listeners today.
Well, I know all our minds have been expanded. To me, you've redefined what data are. And that's the word, are, not is. And it's not just numbers, you all. And also this whole notion of empowering teachers again. I love that. So this has been a great hour. I always learn so much in this broadcast, and I know our listeners do too, because we do hear from them a lot. So I hope you listeners have found this a very fruitful expenditure of your time and a great starting point for becoming more data literate. So thank you again for providing this for us. We want to remind our listeners that this radio webcast, like all our monthly programs, will be archived on our website within the next 2 hours, and it's downloadable for your iPod or your MP3 players, so you can go back and listen again. And you should recommend that your friends and colleagues listen as well, and use the archive program and the PowerPoint for a professional development activity for an entire faculty or staff. Yes, and Terry and Cindy and Jen, we're all going to be on iTunes. I mean, woohoo! This is a big goal of mine. I'm so thrilled about being on iTunes. So you can subscribe to Solutions and get every monthly broadcast. And I think this is the 31st or 32nd one, Terry. We've been doing this a while.
Marty, you're a real star. But anyway, thank you, Cindy and Jen. We really appreciate you being here.
We enjoy being here. We both get pretty excited when we can talk about ways to help teachers know their students, develop good relationships, and just give students what they need to be successful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and we're looking forward to next month, to our next Solutions broadcast, which will be Tuesday, May the 10th. That happens to be my older brother's birthday.
All right.
My brother, the only child. We will be hosting Dr. Jan Bray, the Executive Director of the Association for Career and Technical Education, or ACTE, who will be talking with us all about career and technical education. And so, thanks to all of you for listening and participating. Remember that we know why students are dropping out of school, and with research-based solutions, we can ensure that all of our students graduate. Join us next time for more Solutions to the Dropout Crisis.